Hello, everybody. Let me move that there. It's Michael Pierce here, obviously. I'm going to talk about the Book of Job. Because why not? Actually, before I talk about the Book of Job, a little order of business. I am working on a sequel to the MBTI Apocalypse video. I have not made nearly as much progress as I would like to on account of... Sorry, I've got terrible allergies today. On account of being busy with other things, but also primarily I have had no inspiration for doing it, and I can't do things unless I feel inspired and in the proper mood for it, so it just doesn't go well. But I do feel an inspiration for this, and I wasn't even fully feeling that as of recently, so I'm doing this now because I do want to talk about it, and I think that talking about things helps me to understand it, and I feel like people have been enjoying these videos and have been getting stuff out of it, and so I hope I can offer a new perspective on not just the Book of Job, but on everything that my kind of crazy hypothesis would imply spiritually in a lot of ways. So you're going to have to follow me here in order to be able to understand it, but let's start with the Book of Job, just in case you're not familiar with the Book of Job. It is one of the books of the Bible. It is considered generally grouped with Psalms and Proverbs, and I believe Ecclesiastes as one of the books of so-called wisdom literature. Excuse me, I don't think... No, it is grouped with Psalms. What am I talking about? I hesitated for a moment because I thought there were only 3 in the wisdom literature. And Psalms is a book of hymns, but it also has wisdom in it. But Psalms always comes right before Proverbs. I'm just confusing myself. That's not what I'm going to be talking about because I'm not an expert in Old Testament Hebrew or anything, and yet I'm talking about the Book of Job. But just so you know, the character of Job in the book, it's one of those. It's a book that does not strictly fall into the full narrative of kind of the Old Testament, in terms of, you have the 5 books of Moses that very clearly follow the genealogy, and then from Adam to Abraham to Moses, and then you have talking about the kingdom of Israel after Moses and all of that history. But Job seems to be supposed to take place possibly even before Abraham, though certainly not really within the what's going on with the Israelites. In fact, there's a rabbinical tradition, as I understand it, that calls him one of the Gentile prophets. So it's sort of a general idea, just so you get an idea. So this is kind of something, it's a separate kind of entity. And what it is... Oh, how do you even describe it? It's a series of different approaches and attempts to answer the question, why do good things happen to why do good things happen to bad people, but more importantly, why do bad things happen to good people? Specifically, the specific riddle posed by the life of Job. So if you take it for granted that Job is a fact, and I think even if you don't believe in Job himself as a historical individual, which is perfectly reasonable because this story itself has a very folk-tale-ish quality to it. But you can still see what Job represents in people who you know in your life. And so what happens to Job is, long story short, he's a great guy, he's rich, but he's not prideful. He's extremely generous with his wealth. He's got all these children, blah, blah, blah. He's super faithful and loyal to God. And then for no apparent reason whatsoever, all of his wealth in the same day is taken away, and then not long, it's just like his flocks and herds are slaughtered by sudden raids from different peoples. A wind comes and blows down, destroys the house where all of his children and just happened to be partying, and not partying in a bad way, just like having a really nice happy dinner together, and then it just crashes and kills all of them. And so everything that he has and cares about is taken away from him, and then he gets horrible boils and like this horrible disease, and so he went from literally up here to 0, and there is no apparent reason for it. And so it's an attempt to try to deal with this quandary. Most of the book is taken up by a series of very poetic and very high literature, remarkable poems that is basically detailing a conversation between Job and 3 of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. I hope I'm pronouncing those right. And I'll go ahead and get into the structure. So the thing is, I generally think, just to start off right off the bat, that the book of Job, kind of like the Bible itself, is not a single. It wasn't written by the same individual like someone might write a novel. It's written by a bunch of different individuals, and somebody kind of cobbled it together because they all related to each other, and you can argue whether or not what they cobbled together actually makes an artistic whole. The book of Job, I think, has a number of different authors, and I think this shows in kind of the odd structure that the book has, and the fact that the different structures seem to have different answers to the question that is posed by the book. My running theory right now, which I don't really have any qualifications to posit, but I'm still going to do it anyway just from my experience. I think that there's a core book of Job, and I'll get into what I think that core is. And then there's a bunch of other answers that later people have tagged onto the book of Job in order to try to explain what's going on. So I think the core of the book of Job is, I would even go so far as to say that the original book of Job and its original author was chapter 3, as it is in the King James Version, where Job says, "It would be better for me if I had just died." And it's terrifying language, something like that. And then God's answer to Job, which is the last few chapters, where it says God answers Job out of the whirlwind. In the King James Version, it simply means out of the storm, which is a beautiful image, by the way. It's implying that Job is undergoing this terrible experience, and then God answers him out of that experience and gives him the answer for why he is suffering things. And so I think it was originally this very simple poem based off of a folk tale or a classic story about a man named Job. And so once you know that the book is called Job, you know, oh, okay, this is a poetic rendition of this classic story about a guy who was righteous, and despite that, all these horrible things happened to him, and then God talked to him and explained why. Even though, okay, well, we'll move into that now. That's my theory, is that that's the core. But setting that aside, there's still a number of different sections to Job. There's the opening prose prologue, which is chapters 1 and 2 in the King James Version, which is very understandable, very clear, and it sets up the classic story of what happened to Job, why he's in this terrible situation, and it literally explains that, because it goes as far as to say, before the book of Job is even started and the investigations begin, it goes as far as to explain right off the bat what has happened to Job. Which is why I suspect it was something added in later by somebody who thought that they knew what the full answer to the book is. And I do like their answer. I'm not saying I don't find it without value, but I'm just saying I'm not sure that it was there in whatever the original was. That's my theory. But that's not the crazy idea I was talking about. We haven't gotten to that yet. So you have the prologue. I'll explain what its stance is. You have the prologue that sets things up. You have Job's opening monologue. Then you have a series of alternating speeches between Job and his 3 friends. And you have 3 cycles of this, or 3 rounds of this. So you start with Eliphaz, the first friend, who gives his monologue for a chapter or 2. Then you have Job's response. Then you have Bildad and Job's response. Then you have Zophar and Job's response. And then it starts over again for the second cycle. Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar, Job, and then the third cycle where it's Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, and, oh, what happened to the Zophar piece? Oh, we don't know, because it probably is fragmented and is not there. It was originally, who knows, maybe it went on for 7 cycles or something like that, and we just simply don't have it. That's wild speculation. But it does sort of get fragmentary. We don't have that last piece, assuming that it was there. Maybe it wasn't, and there's some kind of Hebrew tradition about having an incomplete third cycle. I don't know, that's possible. And I just don't know about it. But what you move is you have those cycles, and then you have a poem on wisdom, which is it's a monologue delivered by Job. And then you also have, I believe you also have Job's closing speech, which is unrelated to the three cycles, but it kind of runs into his answer to Bildad, but it can be separated. And then, most interestingly, there is a part that is definitely thought by a number of scholars to have been tagged on later. Not all scholars, but a number of them have theorized that the part with Elihu. So what happens is no mention of a character named Elihu up to this point. Not in the opening prologue or in any of the discussions. And then all of a sudden there's another prose piece that explains there's this other guy named Elihu, by the way, who I guess I just forgot to tell you about him beforehand, but he's been silent this entire time, but then he's like, you're all stupid, and my heart is raging, and I will explain to you the proper answers to these questions. I'm exaggerating a bit, but that's basically what happens, is Elihu just kind of appears, berates everybody, and explains explains a position that aligns a bit more with the prologue than anything else. And then we don't hear anything about Elihu ever again, which is why a lot of people think this is just sort of inserted. Because right after Elihu is when God's answer occurs. And so God's answer to Job takes up a couple of chapters, and God and Job kind of have a conversation. And, well, I'll get to that in a minute. And then you have a brief prose epilogue where God praises and blesses Job, and he's like, you're a great guy, Job. And then he restores Job like 7-fold or twice-fold for everything. And then he says to Job's 3 friends, you all don't know what you're talking about. I'm very angry with you, so you need to repent. And Job will pray for you. And so they get their comeuppance, I guess. No mention of Elihu. And that's the book of Job. So let's delve in a little bit deeper here. What are the different approaches to the answer why Job went through this? Well, the prologue, well, let's start with the dialogue in the middle, because I think that's closer to whatever the original book of Job that I'm positing was. The dialogues with Job's friends in the center basically take on... One of the things that frustrated me, especially when I first read it when I was a kid, was that I was expecting it to be like this great... I didn't really know about Socrates at the time, but I was like this great Socratic dialogue of the minds of like dealing with these deep issues, and then I started reading it and I'm like, they're not arguing with each other, really. Like I mean, part of it is because the language is very, very high. Like high art is what I mean, high literature. And can be very hard for an elementary schooler to follow, because that's how young I was when I first tried reading it. And then I tried reading it more when I was in middle school. But anyway, obviously difficult to follow. But even reading it now, it frustrates me because it's certainly not an argument in the way that us in our post-Greek Western selves think of an argument. I mean, it's really just, it feels so often like just an excuse to do some really flowery poetry. It's very frustrating, guys. It's beautiful stuff. There's great insights in there, but it's like, it's so encased in stuff that often feels like it has nothing to do with the central point. Like, and really, as far as the argument goes, as far as I can tell, the argument can really be reduced down to two basic points, which is Job's friends reiterating the same idea and Job repeatedly refuting that idea. Or not really refuting it, but just saying, no, that's not correct, and here's why. Which is, okay, that's a refutation, but whatever. Someone has pulled up to me who is playing rap music, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. So, and what this reduces down to is, so you have Job's friends, his three friends, who Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, who come to comfort him in his time, and they don't really end up doing that at all, because they come to him and they're trying to understand why this horrible thing has happened to Job. And they say, okay, well, assuming that justice, they never come out and say it this way, but basically the argument is this. Assuming that justice is kind of like, in Plato's Republic, for instance, the first definition of justice that is given and that is later sort of shown to be problematic is that it's basically like it's kind of like a natural science, Newtonian physics kind of principle, where it's just you pay things back for what they do to you. It's like karma. Justice is doing good to your friends and doing evil to your enemies. So it really is like, kind of like an Anaximander's fragment, where it's like things pay each other back for the injustices that they have done. So it's this karma principle, like raw karma, where things just cause and effect happen on each other, and they pay each other back for what has been done to them. So if I punch rubber, then the rubber will sort of bounce back at me with a proportionate force. Equal and opposite force, how Newton would put it. So they're assuming that is kind of what justice would mean. And so if God is just, and if God is just and Job is a friend, then God would reward Job. But if God is just and God has not rewarded Job, but has actually punished Job, then the only explanation is because Job is not God's friend anymore. That Job has become God's enemy. And we're assuming that he is legitimately God's enemy. So their argument is, well, the only explanation we have is that you must have done something wrong, Job, so you just need to admit that, and then things will start getting better. Now, this may seem kind of primitive to some of us at first, as though it's like, well, how simplistic. Now that since the book of Job was written, we have learned that this is not the case. Really, we haven't learned it. There are certainly cases where people will do this with the physical sense, where, we will still say, okay, well, so-and-so, this horrible thing happened to them, so what did they do wrong that caused this thing to happen to them? Because it's a horrifying thought to think that something bad could happen to you and it's not your fault. That's like, well, then I have no control over anything, and it could be extremely, you're on the brink of nihilism when you're at that point. So it's understandable why the karma principle, or the retribution principle of justice is very appealing, because everything is very understandable. It's very scientific. And there's always an explanation and there's always something you can do. But, I'll get into the opposite in a minute. But, we often do this with things like, in the moral sphere, probably, I think if you take the book of Job and you take those dialogues, or even just that central principle, and instead of having it be about material possessions or even Job's physical health, if you make it about mental health, then it becomes profound for our generation, at least for me. Because what Job's argument is, no, I have not done anything wrong. I am blameless, and if I were to say I've done something wrong, in a sense, I would then be doing something wrong because I would be being dishonest. I have done nothing to deserve this. And Job's friends, on the one hand, are, for one, they're kind of like, as people often are, sort of irritated and indignant at this, because it's like, well, nobody's perfect. Like, come on, man, you must have done something. And he's like, I have not done anything to deserve this. And they're like, well, you must have done something. Like, because I know I've done things, I'm not perfect, so what makes you so perfect, right? So there's this envy, resentment kind of there. But also, more importantly, on a philosophical level, what Job is saying, if we go back to that syllogism from before, given that justice is retributive, that is in fact what justice is, that you give good for good and evil for evil, then if Job has done nothing to deserve his punishment, and yet God has punished him, then God is unjust, right? So that is ultimately the point of Job's argument. Job never comes out and says this, because Job isn't sure, at least in the dialogues. But that's the implication, is that God must be unjust. So you see the dichotomy that we have here. Either Job is unjust and has done something wrong, or God is unjust and should not have punished Job, and this shouldn't have happened. And his friends, being pious, are unwilling to accept this, so they have to assume that Job has done something wrong, and it becomes easier and easier for them to say this as their resentment builds at the fact that Job utterly refuses to admit when he hasn't done something wrong to deserve this. And so the reason I mentioned mental health is because that's especially poignant there, I think, for a lot of people. Especially for people dealing with OCD or anxiety or things like that, when they feel immense guilt over something, or they feel shame over something, that they literally have not done anything wrong. And when talking with somebody who does not know what that feeling is like, they're often afraid of getting into a Job scenario, or end up in a Job scenario, where the person says, well, you're depressed or you're anxious. You must have done something to make you depressed or anxious. You feel bad, so you must have done something to make you feel bad. And the person has to then insist, no, I have not done anything bad. That's the problem. If I had done something bad, then I would know what to fix, but I have not done anything bad. And so there's kind of an interesting, there's something I think very, very profound and poignant there. But anyway, that's really kind of what the dialogue ends up amounting to, is just this mounting frustration where his friends start to accuse him of things, like say, well, I bet you did this, or you've committed adultery, or you've, fornicated or something. You must have, because you keep avoiding this issue. And in some cases, they would probably be completely correct, because people often hide their sins. It's very human. But in Job's case, he hadn't. Job is the exception. And that's why this was such a trial for him. But he insists that he has not done anything wrong, and he doesn't know what to make of God. He would like to have an audience with God, but he doesn't know how to talk to God, because God is God, and he doesn't really understand it. So that's middle section. And that's kind of, those are the 2 points of views being thrown back and forth there. The prologue, along with the epilogue, more or less, the epilogue's kind of ambiguous on this point. But assuming it's written along with the prologue, they also hold an opinion, a much more definite opinion on what's going on here. Which is that, which in my opinion does not fully link up with the actual dialogues themselves. Because the prologue states that what happened, you see, is that Satan, which is the term for the accuser, so you could say the accusory angel or the devil, or whatever, however you want to fit it into theology or your cosmology. But the accusing angel, the bad guy or whatever, comes before God and says the only reason that Job is so faithful and awesome and everything is because you've given him all this material wealth and you've prospered him. But if you took all that away, well, then he's a fair weather friend. He'll curse you to your face. And so God's like, challenge accepted. You can go ahead and take away all his stuff. Destroy everything he has. And that's when the whirlwind crushes the one house that kills all of Job's family. All these all the war parties come and slaughter all of his animals. Everything that he has is taken away from him. And then Satan is like, well, but Job replies, well, this sucks, but I'm not going to blame God, because God has every right to take away stuff because it's his planet. So, and blessed be his name. And so Satan's like, well, crap, that didn't work. And so he goes back to God and he's like, okay, he didn't curse your face yet, but he will curse your face if I destroy his body, if I give him horrible diseases. And God's like, yeah, sure, you can try that. And so Satan does that, and that's when his friends come to him. But still, Job, when inquired by his wife, who says, just curse God and die, which it's like, why would you say that to someone? But it doesn't matter. Job refuses, and he's like, I shall take good and ill from God's hand. But then the dialogues start, and the very first thing is Job's speech where he says it would have been better if I had never been born. And throughout the dialogues, it's like he often seems to actually be questioning, even though he had already established that he kind of seemed to know where he stood, which is that I will receive good and evil at his hands. And yet the dialogues all seem to be fully focused on this notion that, that Job hasn't figured this out yet, or that he's not sure about this yet, about whether or not he should be accepting evil at the hands of God when he clearly doesn't deserve it. So there's this, in my opinion, there's this disconnect between the prologue and the actual dialogues that has always been off-putting to me, where it's like just that very fact that within the first few chapters or dialogues in there, Job does not seem to be behaving the same as the Job who was in the prologue, in my opinion. And so, in any case, the prologue's solution to the Job issue is that, okay, and it accords with Elihu's. I think I talked about Elihu. It accords with Elihu's, because Elihu, basically, for all intents and purposes, Elihu argues that actually God can do evil to you and still be just, because sometimes evil, bad things happening to you drives you to become closer to God, or is a test of your integrity, or something like this, right? And that's exactly what the prologue is literally saying, that that's what's going on here, that God allows horrible things to happen, because, it's God's fault. It's God's fault. Even because he could have stopped Satan if he wanted to. So we kind of have to lay some of this at the feet of God, which, by the way, I don't think I've mentioned in the video. That is the position that Jung takes in his famous Answer to Job, which I'm not talking about in this video, maybe another time. But Jung does he goes quite more radical with it, but for all intents and purposes, really this is kind of God's fault. God has done this, not directly in the story, and the reason he's done it is in order to test Job and to do good to him by doing evil to him. So that's kind of the position taken there. Classic idea, fascinating, very kind of Nietzschean in a way. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, all that sort of thing. And I think this is actually explored a little bit in the dialogues, though, and Job refutes it by simply pointing out, this is way overkill. Like, this is so hard. Why am I going through, And that's not really good comfort to give to somebody when they're in such a horrible situation. That it's like, well, this is actually God blessing you, and it's like, screw you. More importantly, anyway, so those are kind of the different positions. Then you have God's answer to Job. So you have Job refuting his friends who are trying to convince him that he must have done something wrong. Job's like, I didn't do something wrong. Elihu is like, you have been doing something wrong by not admitting your guilt, but nevertheless, the main reason for this is because God is testing you, and I think that's something added on. And then you have the answer of God directly to Job. God's answer to Job is very enigmatic. The the way that it is traditionally interpreted is that God, because what happens is God comes down, and the way at least that it's traditionally translated is that God begins asking Job a long series of rhetorical questions, the answer to which is supposed to be no, basically. In fact, I'm going to get my computer out here because I've been working on trying. I'm an amateur biblical translator with the huge emphasis on amateur, because I can't speak or write in Hebrew or Greek. I'm getting tiny bit better with Greek, just from experience, but I use a website called Bible Hub to explore the individual words, and it's extraordinarily helpful. But anyway, I've been using it to try to help me to understand more in depth, especially with the book of Job, more of what is going on in there. Here we go. But, and speaking of that, by the way, the Hebrew in the book of Job Hebrew in itself, ancient Hebrew can often be very difficult, but the Hebrew in the poetry, especially in God's answer to Job, is in a number of places extremely frustrating and problematic and difficult to tease out exactly what's being said, and so often I think people are falling back on. I don't know for sure, but I think that in a number of cases, translators simply don't know what is supposed to be said here, so they fall back on traditions about what is traditionally supposed to be conveyed. The nature of God's answer to Job is, like I said, it seems to be a series of rhetorical questions along the lines of that are meant to demonstrate God's superiority. What I'm trying to get at here is that God doesn't really answer Job. At least that seems to be what's happening. God comes down. Jung talks about this, where it's kind of like God seems to be missing the point, because Job has never questioned that God is all-powerful. If anything, he's affirmed God is all-powerful, because that's why this is problematic. He knows God has done this. God has already demonstrated how powerful he is, so it's not a question of his power. It's a question of whether or not he's good or not. And so God coming down and asking question after question, which really just is, it's just all these questions that it's like, I don't know, it's like an English romantic poet wrote it, where he's like, the sublimity of nature, that and I think a lot of people assume that and maybe it's correct, but I have trouble buying that God's answer to Job is simply, I am all powerful, so stop complaining. Or something along the lines of, things are so complicated and you don't understand them, so I'll tell you why you suffered when